A tall figure moved between the trees, but cast no shadow. We noticed the absence before we noticed the shape. Our headlamps cut thin cones through the fog, pale and jittering, their batteries already complaining in the cold. Shadows should have been everywhere. Branches clawing across the ground, trunks breaking the light into hard angles. But there was a vertical gap where the darkness failed to behave. A corridor without contrast. Light went there and didn't come back the way it should have. Then the figure stepped forward. It was tall, taller than any person I'd known, but not exaggerated. Proportions close enough to feel deliberate. It moved between the trees with a patient economy, never brushing a branch, never disturbing the fog. Its outline was visible only because the forest seemed to bend around it, trunks parting by inches, leaves angling away. Our lights passed through its body and landed intact on the bark behind it, as if nothing had intervened. But it cast no shadow. The cold air burned in my lungs. Damp soil pressed through my boots, each step sinking deeper than expected, the ground softening as though recently turned. The forest had gone silent in the way it does when sound is not welcome. No insects, no distant water, no settling creaks. Even our breathing felt intrusive. We didn't speak. Words felt too solid for what we were seeing. The figure moved again, not toward us, not away. Laterally, purposeful. Each step placed with care, as if it were following a path that only it could see. Fog slid through its legs without curling or breaking. When it passed in front of a birch, the pale bark showed clean and uninterrupted, the stripes uncut by silhouette. I lifted my lamp higher. The beam flickered, not dimmed, but misaligned, the edges bending slightly inward where it intersected the figure, as though space itself had developed a seam. My stomach tightened with a sudden, irrational certainty. The light didn't know what to do with it. We tested the ground. When one of us shifted left, a root surfaced where there had been none, pale and slick, guiding the foot back into place. Trees leaned subtly, not falling, just enough to close options. The forest was arranging us. The figure stopped. Up close, closer than I wanted, it was less distinct. Not transparent exactly. More like an omission. Details that should have been there simply weren't. No facial features, no texture, only a suggestion of shoulders, limbs, a head shaped like a thought someone abandoned halfway through. Still no shadow. Every object around it obeyed the rules except that one. Branches cast long fingers across the soil. Our bodies threw distorted doubles behind us. Even the fog made soft gradients of dark and light. The figure remained exempt, untouched by consequence. That was when the wrongness clarified. It wasn't unseen. It was unregistered. The forest knew where it was. Trees leaned away, paths curved, but it refused to describe it. Like an eye sliding past something it had learned not to focus on. The shadows misaligned around it, stretching too far or stopping short, creating a ring of subtle error that made my head ache if I stared too long. The figure resumed walking. Each step fell in time with a pressure change in the air, a faint inward pull, as if the forest were holding its breath and releasing it just for that motion. Our headlamps flickered again, not failing, but hesitating, the light stuttering as though waiting for permission. We followed without deciding to. The ground sloped downward into a stand of older trees, their trunks thick and scarred, bark ridged like knuckles. The fog thickened, beating cold on our lashes. Somewhere behind us, a sound tried to echo and gave up halfway through. The figure passed close enough that I felt colder on one side of my body than the other. Not a draft, an absence of warmth. When I reached out, without remembering choosing to, my hand met nothing. No resistance, no chill. Just space that felt recently vacated. Ahead, the forest opened into a shallow clearing. Moonlight should have pooled there, but instead it fractured, breaking into dull reflections off damp leaves. The figure stood at the center, perfectly vertical, as if waiting. Around it, the trees leaned inward, branches interlacing above like a ribcage. Shadows gathered thick at the perimeter, careful not to cross the invisible boundary where the figure stood. The silence deepened until it felt engineered. One of us whispered its name, Not a name we'd agreed on, just a sound shaped like a question. The forest reacted instantly. Branches creaked. The ground shifted. The figure did not. Light passed through it again, wrong in the same way, unchanged. I realized then what unsettled me most. The figure had never looked at us. Not once. Its attention was elsewhere, fixed on something deeper in the woods, something beyond the clearing. We were incidental, markers on the edge of a process already underway. The trees began to straighten, slowly, reluctantly, as if released from tension. A path opened behind the figure, narrow and precise. The soil pressed flat as though by repeated passage. It did not align with any trail we knew. The figure stepped forward. As it did, the forest adjusted. Shadows slid into new positions. Fog thinned just enough to reveal depth, distance, direction. The environment described everything except the thing moving through it. The figure paused at the threshold of the path. For the first time, something changed. The light around its feet bent inward, the soil darkening. Not with shadow, but with implication. A suggestion of imprint without form. It didn't look back. It moved on, deeper into the trees, still casting no shadow, still unacknowledged by light, still carefully avoided by the forest that nevertheless made way for it. When it was gone, the silence remained. We stood there, headlamp steady now, fog drifting normally again. The clearing looked ordinary, almost disappointingly so. But the shadows were wrong. Each of ours fell in a slightly different direction, angles off by just enough to notice. I looked down at the ground where the figure had stood. There was no footprint, no mark, nothing to prove it had been there at all, except that the soil was cold, colder than the ground around it, as if something had stood there long enough for the earth to forget how to hold warmth, and was now making room for it to return. The trees whispered warnings whenever we walked past them. The forest had been old before names learned how to stick. That was the thought that came to me as the whispers began. Not words exactly, not sounds you could point to, but a pressure in the air that gathered meaning the longer you stood still. We were deep enough that the canopy swallowed the sky entirely. The night pressed down into layers of black and gray. Fog drifted low, thick as breath on glass, sliding around roots and pooling in hollows. Every step released the smell of damp bark and cold soil, ancient and mineral, like something long sealed had been unburied. At first, the whispers felt incidental. Leaves brushing together, bark shifting as trunks cooled. The quiet creak of old wood settling. The kind of forest noise you learn to ignore if you spend enough time outdoors. Then we walked past the first stand of yews. As we moved between them, the air changed. The fog pulled inward, thinning around the trunks, and the sound began, not in our ears, but along the edges of perception. A soft, layered murmur that rose and fell, syllables forming and collapsing before they could become words. It carried through leaves and down the grain of the bark, vibrating faintly through the soles of my boots. I slowed. The whispers intensified. They weren't directed at us. That was the unsettling part. There was no emphasis, no urgency aimed our way. It felt like overhearing a conversation through a wall. Tones sharp with concern, cadence heavy with repetition. Warnings, maybe, or reminders. When I stepped back, the sound faded. We tested it again. Forward. The murmurs returned, brushing against comprehension and then slipping away. Backward. Silence, sudden and complete. No insects, no wind, just the soft sound of our breathing, too loud, too present. The forest reacted to motion. As we continued, the pattern repeated. Each cluster of older trees, thick trunks, bark rough with centuries, produced the same effect. Whispers layered over whispers, never identical, always shifting. Sometimes the sound seemed to rise from the ground itself, traveling through roots beneath the soil. Other times it moved through the canopy, leaves trembling without wind, branches flexing like joints adjusting position. The cold deepened. It crept up through the ground and settled into our knees and wrists, tightening tendons, slowing movement. Fog slid higher, brushing against our waists, our chests, dampening fabric and muting sound. Our footsteps began to echo wrong, delayed, distorted, returning from directions that didn't match the terrain. We tried to listen harder. That was a mistake. The whispers didn't resolve into language, but patterns began to emerge. Repetition, emphasis, a rhythm that suggested structure, as if the forest were circling the same idea from different angles. Certain sounds returned again and again, long, drawn-out consonants that vibrated through the bark, soft breaks like warnings cut short. Not don't, not leave, something more observational, something like near. Paths began to shift, not dramatically, no sudden walls of trees or impossible geometry, just subtle adjustments. A trail that curved slightly when it should have run straight. A fallen log that hadn't been there moments earlier, forcing us to step aside. Closer to the trunks, closer to the whispers. When we tried to mark our route, the ground resisted, soil too loose to hold a clear impression. Leaf litter rearranging itself when we looked away. The trees leaned, only a few degrees at first, barely noticeable unless you were watching. Trunks angling inward, branches dipping low as we passed beneath them. Shadows detached from their sources, sliding a fraction out of alignment before settling again. The forest seemed to be adjusting its posture, bracing. The whispers grew denser. They layered over one another until it felt like standing inside a crowd you couldn't see. The sound pressed in from all sides, not louder, just more insistent, as if more voices were contributing. The cadence changed when we stopped, accelerating slightly, the murmurs tightening. We realized then that the forest wasn't reacting to our presence. It was reacting to our movement. When we stood still, the whispers softened, became diffuse, almost distant. When we walked, they sharpened, quickened, carrying a strained quality that hadn't been there before. The trees closest to us vibrated faintly, bark creaking without splitting, roots shifting underfoot with slow, deliberate pressure. We tried to leave. The direction we had come from no longer existed in the same way. The forest floor dipped sharply, fog thickened, and the path dissolved into uneven ground choked with undergrowth that hadn't been there earlier. Turning another way brought us into a stand of trees so tightly spaced we had to turn sideways to pass. Their bark slick and cold, the whispers there nearly constant. They followed us. Not the sound itself, but the topic. The same repeated cadence, the same emphasis. A warning that never quite reached articulation. Each time we thought we caught a word, it slipped sideways, transformed into something adjacent. The whispers weren't about us. That realization settled slowly, heavy as the cold. The forest wasn't concerned with where we were going or what we were doing. The tension in the sound wasn't directed outward. It felt like anticipation, like watching the horizon for something you can't yet see. The ground ahead of us sloped downward into a shallow basin where the fog lay thick and unmoving. No breeze disturbed it. The trees around the basin leaned away from the center, their branches drawn back, leaves trembling faintly. Shadows pooled along the perimeter, deep and heavy, refusing to cross the open space. The whispers changed there. They lowered, flattened, becoming more uniform, less frantic, less layered. The cadence slowed, stretched out, as if the forest were running out of time or patience. The sound traveled through the roots now, vibrating up through our legs, settling into bone. I felt watched, not from above, not from behind, from ahead. The fog in the basin rippled once, gently, like something exhaling beneath a sheet. The whispers surged in response, sharp and overlapping, carrying a strained urgency that scraped against understanding. Something was coming through the trees behind us. Not fast, not loud. The forest didn't react the way it would to an animal or a storm. No sudden movements, no panicked noise. Instead, the trunks nearest that direction leaned farther away, creating a narrow corridor through which the sound traveled. The whispers weren't telling us to run. They were documenting. We felt it then, a shift in pressure, a subtle displacement of air that didn't correspond to wind. The shadows along the corridor deepened, stretching longer than the light allowed. The forest grew very still, as if holding itself in a specific shape. The whispers softened as the presence drew nearer, becoming almost reverent. We didn't see anything. That was the worst part. No shape broke the fog. No sound announced itself. Only the forest's reaction. Trees leaning back, roots tightening, branches lifting out of the way. The whispers faded into something like resignation. As the air behind us cooled further, settling into a dense, unnatural stillness, I understood what the warnings had been circling all along. Not danger, not death, something closer to arrival. The fog in the basin parted slightly, just enough to suggest depth where there had been none before. The whispers stopped altogether, and in the sudden silence, the forest leaned away from us, as if making room for something that had finally caught up.